Alex, you were just watching the reaction from the Ukrainian MP there.
Yeah, I thought that was a powerful interview, but I think people who have crossed Putin already know the story. Putin, of course, authorised the murder in this country of Alexei Litvinenko using a state-refined isotope, polonium-210. He might as well have signed a note saying, I did this, Vladimir Putin. There's no subtlety here. Indeed, subtlety is the enemy of Putin's objective, which is to say to the world, if you cross me, you will die. And that is what's happened to Alexei Navalny, a man who may have had his flaws, but had one shining quality. He was willing to stand up to Vladimir Putin. For that, he has died.
Benjamin?
I mean, I think that's exactly right. You know, what Putin has shown us time and time again is that he has no respect for the rules by which most of the rest of the world exists. And I think that should bring into sharp focus the kind of decision-making that the US is having at the moment in Congress about whether they should give more military aid to help Ukraine. Because here is a man that, as you say, has killed on British soil, has killed his main opposition leader in a way that we all knew was coming, including Navalny himself. He'd said it in the past. And he is continuing to wage war on Ukraine. I think this naivety that seems to be spreading around some sections of the right, at least in the US, that Putin is actually not some kind of heir to Hitler, as David Cameron implied in a comment earlier this week. I think this should bring into sharp focus just how aggressive he's willing to be and just how little he cares for opposition unless it is forceful opposition.
Do you believe it will when it comes to Congress?
I don't believe, I hope that the Americans will support the fighters of Ukraine in the way that I believe them to deserve. But to pick up on what Benjamin was saying, I think there's naivety in at least two... I agree with your point, but I think there's naivety in at least two other areas. The first is on the left, where people have fallen for this notion that Ukrainians are Nazis. You know, as soon as they were called Nazis, a certain... Not all of the left, obviously, but some people on the left have fallen for that. And the second, extraordinarily, is amongst some broadcasters who, because they gained access to Vladimir Putin, suddenly were permitted the most fawning and weak and naive kind of interviewing. Tucker Carlson, I cannot imagine how he feels today. He goes over and becomes what can only be called a useful idiot for the Putin's regime and allows him to give this bizarre, sprawling interview where, asked, why did you invade Ukraine, where he says, well, let's take us back to 1300s and the Black Death, and you've got on. And he goes out and talks about the gumdrop smiles on the streets of Russia and how happy people are in the supermarkets and so forth. And in the very week that pathetic interview drops, Putin's main opposition is murdered in custody.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it, Benjamin? Russia is an amazing country with a cultural history that is beautiful in so many ways. But then to see someone like Tucker Carlson have this sort of softly approach with a dictator of this kind, and then we get this news a week later, there's certain dark irony to it.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the vast majority of the world's media were not so naive as Tucker Carlson was. And I wasn't against him doing the interview. You know, it's about 2 hours long that I imagine lots of people have watched by this point. But the fact is that he didn't challenge Putin. He was naive to his instincts. And there's no doubt, you know, I love visiting former Soviet countries. I find them absolutely fascinating. The architecture is incredible. But to focus on that, as he did, is a mistake. Because, you know, what is going on in Ukraine, it is in a very perilous position. You know, their arms, their people are worn down at the moment. It's a critical point. Russia had been doing a lot less attacks, air strikes late last year because they were building up their resources to try and take advantage of Ukraine being in this rut of the delay from the EU and the US giving aid and giving the same scale of aid. And I think we're at a critical point. You know, the fact is that if we don't continue to give the amount of military force and money that Ukraine needs, then what you're going to do is waste the last 2 years because Russia will take advantage of that.
Now, listening to some Conservatives in the States, though, Alex, there is an argument which a lot of people will listen to and really buy into, the idea that, of course, there are so many domestic priorities. People point to the fact that the US can't control their own borders. And then the idea of $60 billion extra aid being given to Ukraine. It's a hard sell.
It is a hard sell, and isolationism has always been in American politics, in their blood, if you like, on both sides of the political aisle. But a mature state is capable of doing more than one thing at once. And you may very well think you've not got your provision right on your southern border. The numbers that were being discussed by the chairman of Republicans Abroad on your channel were absolutely jaw-dropping. The notion of bringing in populations larger than 33 of the American states deaths, I thought was an extraordinary statistic. But you can try and deal with that whilst still realising that helping people oppose Vladimir Putin's invasion of a country in the most significant frontline environment in the world right now is in your national interests. It's not just a bit of humanitarian activity. It's not just a bit of goodwill. It is directly in the Western powers' interests that Putin doesn't win in Ukraine. So, as I say, a mature state can do more than one thing at once. You can recognise you've not got things right on your southern border, or people can debate whether they've got it right or not, but also seek to ensure that Putin doesn't win in Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is in the self-interest of the West. You know, we're seeing increasingly clearly, and the US commentator Tucker Carlson referenced this quite rightly, actually, that there is a new axis forming between autocracies. You're seeing not just China and Russia, but other countries, North Korea trying to get in on there, forming an axis that is actually very powerful in a way that, if you go back to the Cold War, they didn't have this kind of power because they didn't have the financial resource. And if you look at what China is doing in the way that it is funding all sorts of infrastructure projects in African and Caribbean countries, the idea that when there is this very proactive move happening from an alternative eastern axis in the world, that we would then have countries like the US coming back from its position as trying to help, you know, the world order as we've understood it.
But of course, our military, we're always constantly told how depleted it is, so we need more money there too, as well as being sent abroad. But does this vindicate what's happened here with Alexei Navalny? Does this vindicate or at least bolster David Cameron's tough approach with the States?
In my view, 100%. In my view, I mean, there is a rich irony that Navalny was murdered in the same week that the Americans are debating whether or not to support the Ukrainians. There's a rich irony, too, in the fact that it happened the same week the Tucker Carlson interview dropped. But you could not find a more pointed example of where Putin is absolutely wrong and the rest of the world in opposing his invasion of Ukraine is right. After all, people who lead political systems throughout the world have their opponents. It's Putin, first and foremost now, who's killing them.
Well, yes, and now there is no real opposition at all. Not any.
Well, I mean, he was an incredible man, but I'm not sure if he was a real opposition because he wasn't given the chance.
He was imprisoned.
Yeah. Exactly.